whoever here is an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur wants to do something interesting on their own, innovative, etc. How many of us are trying to do that? Okay, now what do you all think is the key defining aspect of an entrepreneur? I mean, just throw it out there, say it out loud. What do you think in a word or two defines an entrepreneur? Ideas.
Okay.
Innovation. Courage. Anything else? Persistence. Execution. Risk taker. Interesting. Okay. So before, I wanted to spend basically just 10 minutes today giving you a little bit about what I did so far and giving you some of the lessons I've learned, the mistakes that I've made, and what I did wrong, what I did, I think, right. Now, I mean, for what it's worth, I'm not an experienced entrepreneur. I started just a couple of years ago, but I'm working on 2 ventures. One of them is in the energy space, in clean tech sustainable development, which is Fugu Energy. The other one is a co-working space for entrepreneurs, where we can bring together potential entrepreneurs and put them in an ecosystem where they can learn and benefit from one another. Now, one thing that, coming back to this point on what defines an entrepreneur, I wanted to touch up on one important thing, which is this idea that an entrepreneur loves risk, right? And from what I've read, I'm not saying this on my experience, I'm really young and I can't say anything on my own, but from what I've read and what I've learned, and from the cases that I've seen, the entrepreneur is not the risk taker. The entrepreneur is the person who manages the risk best. Right? So if you think that you want to be an entrepreneur just because you're out there trying to take on risk, I'd argue that the best entrepreneur is the person that can pass on the risk to someone else. So think about that when you're trying to develop your venture. So, given that, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the mistakes that I've made as an entrepreneur in these past couple of years in the different ventures. Number 1, don't sell a concept. Right? So whatever you're developing, the hardest thing to do is to sell something that is not specific, either a product or a service. If you're trying to sell a change in something, like we were trying to do with Fugu, we were trying to sell energy efficiency. We were trying to sell resources being used more effectively. But it's a hard thing to do. People want to see something very specific, which is either a service or a product, and in this part of the world they're more leaning towards a product than actually a service. The second lesson is in your team. So when you're starting up this venture, really be very careful in what you need in terms of complementary skills. And you need to know yourself before you go out there and start a company. Are you a person who likes to work on your own, or are you a person who likes to work in a team? If you're a person that likes to work in a team, who are the people that you like to work with? My partners were my best friends, so I knew I could work with them. But my problem was that my partners were not on this venture full time. So if you're the type of person who likes to be constantly interacting with someone, make sure you have a team that is constantly there with you in this journey, because the team is where everything starts. The third point is on defining your value proposition through a business plan. And one thing that we did is we had it relatively easy because my partners were funding the venture. And we didn't know what the market looked like in food. We weren't sure yet what was going to happen. So we said, let's start and see where the market will take us. Maybe it's a product, maybe it's a service, maybe it's, we finance, maybe we end up doing something else. So we said, let's see as it goes along and then develop our offering much more clearly. But in retrospect, it's much easier and much more structured if you're to define a business plan before you start, even though that business plan changes. And keep that in mind, because the vast majority of successes are those where the business plan is flexible. It can change, it should change as you develop, because you learn new things as the venture goes forward. The next one is in developing, and this is something we learned, I learned in my second venture in the hub, is to develop a very structured approach. And one approach to this is called the MAP, so measurable, accountable plan, right? So where you basically list out amongst your team members what everybody should do, when they should do it, and who is accountable and how things get done. That way every week you can test amongst your teams who's working, who's not working, how are things progressing. The fifth one is in testing the revenue model as soon as possible. So the whole point of a business is to make money. But we don't know beforehand if you're actually going to make money. So the point is that you need to, as quickly as you possibly can, run a test and see if people are willing to pay for your service or your product. And keep in mind that interest in your offering is very different from the willingness to pay. We got a lot of interest. Everybody loved Fugu, but not a lot of people were willing to pay, right? So before you get, and the problem with entrepreneurs is that you're very passionate about something, right? You only want to do something that you really love doing. So when people tell you they're interested in what you're doing, you get excited, you're happy, people are interested, you think there's a market there. But that clouds your vision. You should try and separate the interest in what you're doing to what people are actually willing to pay for. And try and do that as early as possible. The other one is to really prioritize. So take a step back and say exactly what am I trying to prove in the next month, in the next 6 months, and find out how to go about that step by step. Find a champion, right? And these are called the early adopters. So what you're trying to do is innovative, right? That was mentioned earlier. An entrepreneur is innovative. But if you're doing something innovative, a lot of people don't want or don't understand it. So find one client and latch onto that person with everything you've got and make sure that they take you seriously and that you can learn a lot from these people. Don't waste your time in just meeting people. Right? And that's something that I did earlier on. So people are interested, people want to learn more about you. They, oh, Fugu's cool, it's clean tech, it's young people, let's meet and discuss. But it really ends up wasting a lot of time. So be very focused on what you want to get out of a meeting. Before you go and meet someone, okay, what are the specific goals you want to get out of it? And rather than just going and meeting people just for the sake of meeting and learning. Be very slow to hire someone and very quick to fire someone. It's a very, very important lesson that I learned early on. We hired somebody too quickly, but the good thing is we fired him very, very quickly too. But be very, very slow to hire somebody because it saves you the cost. It cost us about $50,000 to fly them out there, to pay their salary, etc. But we fired them within 3 weeks. Right? So be very, very slow to hire because it does cost you. The last point that I want to mention is it's more of a personal one for all entrepreneurs. Like I mentioned, entrepreneurs are typically very passionate. But we typically get blinded by that passion. And that happened to me. Is in Fugu, you're so in love with your concept that you stop realizing that the market is sending you signals, right? So be very careful, and this could happen within your team. If you bring on members of your team that are more clear, that are more structured, that can take a step back, that aren't as blinded by the love for your product that you're trying to do, and can see the specific signs. Because a lot of times those signs will make you stop a venture or change your approach much more quickly. So keep that in mind. And I just wanted to give you just these are the thoughts that I went through in the first venture. And be clear that we're all going to make mistakes, right, as entrepreneurs. And if you look at the vast majority of success stories, a lot of them started with failures. Right? So even though we see these phenomenal role models and mentors and Steve Jobs and all these great people who are innovative, look at all of them and also try and dig a little deeper and see what they failed before they actually succeeded. A lot of times, the vast majority of times, they have failed before they succeed. So don't be afraid of failure, but the most important thing is being able to take your mistakes and use that to better yourself in your next venture. Because entrepreneurs should never stop once they start going. And I'll leave the rest of them for Q&A if you have any questions I'd like to answer. Thank you.